it gives Reform the impression of momentum. What was the first thing Nigel Farage said at the seven-way ITV debate last night? We have now overtaken the Conservatives in the opinion polls. We are now the real opposition to Labour. Even though it was just one poll, Nigel Farage can now say that, and indeed he will say that every time he's in front of a microphone.
Now, Peter, let's start with you. Obviously, the big news is that this YouGov poll of the Times now puts Reform ahead of the Conservatives. Reform UK up 2 points on 19%. The Tories are on 18%. How significant is this, Peter?
I don't think the 1 point difference between Conservative and Reform is that significant, well within the margin of error. Look, let's separate out about what we are pretty sure about and what we're not sure about. We can't be sure that Reform have overtaken the Tories. All the other polls show the Tories ahead of Reform. What we can be sure of is that over the last couple of weeks, the Tory party support has slipped by 2 or 3 percentage points, and Reform is up a few percentage points. Indeed, when I've been looking at all the polls since the election was called, and if you add together Conservative and Reform, the right of centre vote, that has stayed pretty constant at around 36%. If you add up Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, they've remained constant on 58%. And what's been happening over the last week or two is some of the Tory votes have drifted to Reform and some of Labour's votes have drifted to the Lib Dems and the Greens. But the left-right balance simply hasn't changed.
And when you just explain, Peter, when you say margin of error, what is that? What does that mean when people, who have better things to do with their lives normally, during election campaigns, start looking at polls? What do we mean when we say margin of error?
Well, Simon, let's say if you toss a coin 100 times, it should, on average, come up 50 heads and 50 tails. But a perfectly good coin, you might come up 53 heads and 47 tails, or vice versa. It's the same with measuring party supports from a sample of a couple of thousands. And you would normally reckon on the kind of sample that YouGov had that each party support will be within maybe a couple of percentage points. So when you say the Conservatives are on 18, it might be 16, it might be 20. If you say Reform are on 19, it might be 17, it might be 21. So as you can see, there's a big overlap in the possibilities as to who's really ahead. And that's one of the reasons why the polls do vary. They have slightly different methodologies. They're not all identical, but they all have the problem that any poll faces, and I had when I was running YouGov, that you can't be sure to within 2 or 3 percentage points, even if it's a perfectly conducted poll, what the exact figure is.
So in a way, Patrick, the impact of this is less numerical and more what it might have on the psychology of Conservative MPs.
Exactly. Peter is, of course, right. But the worst people at reading polls are probably politicians and journalists. And I'm not necessarily sure the order there makes any difference. And look, notwithstanding everything Peter says, it's a psychological impact. Tory MPs who want to believe that Rishi Sunak's strategy is failing, who want to believe that the answer to their problems is Nigel Farage, who are worried that the worst is going to come to pass on the 4th of July, now have a proof point, even if it's not proof of exactly what it says or exactly what it appears to say, now have a proof point for all of their anxieties, their hopes, their dreams of a different Conservative Party. And that is the real impact that this is going to have. And also, it gives Reform the impression of momentum. What was the first thing Nigel Farage said at the seven-way ITV debate last night? We have now overtaken the Conservatives in the opinion polls. We are now the real opposition to Labour. Even though it was just one poll, Nigel Farage can now say that, and indeed he will say that every time he's in front of a microphone.
I mean, the thing that struck me actually was I sort of thought, having looked at them, and I know it's margin of error, so it might just be a blip, but actually it's taken a while to get there. You might have expected, it was the beginning of was it only the beginning of last week, Nigel Farage threw his hat in the ring? But you'd have thought that might have been the moment that electrified it, and actually maybe Rishi Sunak had got over that hump. Harry, I assume your phone lit up with delighted Tory MPs getting in touch last night.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine the Tory party are going to take this with all the grace, humour and dignity they've spent the last few years displaying in government. I agree with Patrick as well on this one, though. It's a talking point. We're here in sunny Puglia for the G7.
It does look lovely, Harry. I hope you've got a hat.
It's very nice, I have to say. we're in the media hotel, but we did go over to the main summit venue this morning for breakfast with the PM, and obviously it was all that we were talking about. And he had to sort of acknowledge he didn't really do the "it's just one poll." He just said, "Look, this has happened. We've got to crystallize what this means in voters' minds for the next 3 weeks." And that means sort of hammering that, he immediately went on to his Labour blank check, and he's sort of almost trying to use the reform surge to scare what was left of that 2019 sort of Tory voting coalition into not going over to reform and actually holding their nose and sticking with him for fear of what's worse. And that's not exactly the strongest campaigning point you want to be in. He's almost sort of admitting defeat already and saying, it's all about the size of the sort of size of the Starmer majority rather than really addressing head on that a Starmer majority is coming.
And speaking to Labour pessimists last night, of which there are still remarkably very many, the point they made was underneath the bonnet of that YouGov poll, underneath the headline voting intention, was a very interesting statistic that said 80% of Reform voters, more than any other party, thought a large Labour majority would be bad for the country. So, I'd be interested in what Harry's picking up on this. Does that give the Conservative Party hope? Does that give CCHQ hope that if they constantly hammer this message home about a massive Labour majority and a blank cheque for Labour, they can draw back some of that Reform vote?
What do you think about that, Peter? Is there, because we talked earlier I think it was only yesterday on the show, we were talking about this idea of John Major right until the last moments in 97 was still saying we can win this or, get out and vote and all that. Is there any evidence from anywhere else of any other elections that if you flip to from, vote for us, we're going to win, to don't give the other side a stonking majority, is there any evidence that that might work for the Conservatives, that actually there is a way of squeezing the Labour vote?
Not really, and there's a reason for this. That people like us, journalists, pollsters, whatever, after the election, we say the public have wanted a Labour landslide, whatever. You can't vote for either a landslide or a narrow majority. You vote for a particular party. But what I think could be happening, which has the same effect, but a different sort of causation, is I wonder whether the reason why the Lib Dems and Greens are beginning to pick up support is because people who really do want more radical action on climate change or on the EU or Gaza or whatever, they're saying to themselves, actually, Labour doesn't need my vote, it will win anyway. So they feel free, if you like, to vote for what they really want, which is a more radical agenda than Labour's putting forward. Whereas if it was a closer election, they might say, well, Labour really does need my vote if you're going to kick the Tories out. That may be where there's some effect.